dysentery, cholera, typhus, malaria, pneumonia, scurvy, yellow fever. These are the true killers that decimated the United States Army throughout the 1800s. During the American Civil War alone, 2 out of every 3 soldier deaths, over 400,000 men, came not from bullets or bayonets but from disease. During the Indian Wars that followed on the frontier, from the 1860s through the 1890s, American soldiers stationed at forts across the West died by the thousands from illnesses that swept through their crowded, unsanitary military camps. But here is the paradox that has fascinated historians for over a century. The Native American warriors those soldiers were sent to fight, the Comanche, the Apache, the Lakota Sioux, the Cheyenne, rarely got sick. They lived on the same plains, they drank the same water, they breathed the same air, they faced the same brutal weather. And yet, while the American soldiers dropped dead by the hundreds inside their fort walls from dysentery and cholera and typhoid fever, the native warriors remained astonishingly healthy. How was this possible? How could an entire people, living without hospitals, without pharmacies, without doctors, without antibiotics, without vaccines, resist diseases that were killing trained soldiers of the mightiest nation on earth? The answer will shock you, because it reveals something profound about medicine, about hygiene, about diet, and about the terrifying failures of 19th century American military organization. Today you will discover why Native Americans rarely got sick while millions of American soldiers died. And you will understand a truth that American history books have largely ignored for over 150 years. Let us start with the facts. The American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, killed approximately 620,000 soldiers, more than all other American wars combined until the Vietnam War. But of those 620,000 deaths, only about 205,000 were from battlefield injuries. The remaining 415,000 men, 2 out of every 3 soldiers who died from disease. Dysentery killed 45,000 Union soldiers alone. Typhoid fever killed 29,000 more. Malaria was endemic in southern camps. Pneumonia struck down thousands during the winter campaigns. Measles, mumps, smallpox, and even simple wound infections that could have been prevented with basic hygiene killed men who had survived the fiercest combat of the war. The Indian Wars that followed, when American troops were sent west to fight native tribes for control of the Great Plains and the Southwest, showed the same pattern. At Fort Riley in Kansas during 1867, a cholera outbreak killed 65 soldiers in just 3 months, more than had died in any single battle against the Cheyenne that year. At Fort Union in New Mexico, dysentery ravaged troops sent to fight the Apache. At Fort Fetterman in Wyoming, pneumonia and typhoid killed dozens each winter. The average soldier stationed at a frontier fort during the 1870s had a higher chance of dying from disease within his enlistment period than of dying in combat against a native warrior. Military records show this repeatedly. In the Western campaigns from 1865 to 1890, disease killed roughly 3 times as many soldiers as combat did. Meanwhile, the Native Americans fighting those wars, the Comanche, Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Apache, and Kiowa, had almost none of these health problems. When American soldiers encountered native warriors in battle, they were struck by the physical superiority of their enemies. Native men were often taller than the average American soldier. They were more muscular. They had straighter teeth, they had clearer eyes, they had thicker hair. They moved with greater speed and endurance, and they almost never appeared sick. American doctors serving on the frontier documented this repeatedly in their letters and reports. Dr. George Croghan, a surgeon at Fort Sill in the 1870s, wrote that Comanche warriors brought to his post as prisoners were, quote, in far better physical condition than any regiment of American troops I have ever examined, end of quote. Dr. Washington Matthews, an Army physician who studied Navajo medicine in the 1870s, reported that the Navajo he examined had lower rates of nearly every disease category compared to the soldiers in his own garrison. Dr. Elliot Kues, who traveled through Cheyenne territory in the 1860s, observed that native warriors he encountered showed almost no signs of the digestive disorders, respiratory infections, or skin diseases that were universal among frontier soldiers. How was this possible? Let us examine the reasons systematically, because the answer is not what most modern Americans have been taught. The first and most important reason was hygiene. This will shock most people, because popular American culture has taught for generations that Native Americans were dirty savages while European settlers were civilized and clean. The truth is exactly the opposite. Native Americans across North America bathed daily, often multiple times a day when water was available. The Cherokee had a religious duty to bathe in a river every morning at dawn as an act of purification. The Sioux bathed in streams throughout the day during the summer. The Apache used sweat lodges regularly, sometimes daily, to purify themselves. Even in winter, when full bathing was impossible, Native Americans rubbed their bodies with clean snow or with sand, or with special herbs to maintain cleanliness. Compare this to the American soldier of the 1860s. In the average Union Army camp during the Civil War, soldiers might bathe once a month. In frontier forts, where water had to be hauled from distant rivers, soldiers sometimes went weeks or months without washing thoroughly. Their uniforms were worn continuously, day and night for weeks at a time. Lice and fleas were universal. Bedbugs infested the wooden bunks, and when soldiers finally did bathe, they often did so in water that had already been used for cooking, washing dishes, or watering horses. The result was catastrophic. Skin infections spread through fort barracks like wildfire. Parasites transmitted diseases from man to man. And when one soldier came down with dysentery, the entire barracks would often follow within days, because hand-washing after using the latrine was not systematically practiced by American troops. The second reason was sanitation. Native American villages had strict, culturally enforced rules about where human waste could be deposited. Latrines, if they existed, were placed far away from drinking water sources. Food waste was buried or burned. Corpses of animals killed for meat were processed cleanly, with waste products either eaten, used for other purposes, or disposed of far from living areas. The result was that native villages, even large ones, had minimal contamination of drinking water with fecal bacteria. American military camps were often the opposite. Latrines, when they were dug at all, were often placed too close to water sources. In the crowded fortifications during the Civil War, soldiers sometimes urinated and defecated wherever they could, particularly during long battles when leaving one's position was impossible. Water for cooking and drinking was often drawn from streams that had been contaminated by upstream camps. The famous Confederate prison at Andersonville was so contaminated with human waste that its water source killed prisoners by the hundreds without any need for direct violence. Frontier forts followed similar patterns, though on a smaller scale. Contamination of drinking water by military waste was one of the main killers of American soldiers throughout the 19th century. The third reason was diet. Native Americans across the continent ate diverse diets rich in fresh meat, wild vegetables, fruits, nuts, berries, and natural fats. The Plains warriors ate buffalo meat, rich in vitamin B and iron. Eastern woodlands peoples ate corn, beans, and squash, providing a complete range of amino acids. Northwest coast peoples ate salmon and other fish rich in omega-3 fatty acids. Southwestern peoples ate a diet of beans, corn, chili peppers, and small game. All of these diets were unprocessed, unpreserved with chemicals, and locally sourced. Compare this to American military rations. Union soldiers during the Civil War lived primarily on hardtack, a cracker made from flour and water baked so hard it had to be soaked to be edible. They ate salt pork, which was often so heavily preserved with salt that it caused significant nutrient imbalances. They ate dried beans that had been sitting in warehouses for years. They drank coffee brewed from grounds that had been carried for weeks in dirty containers. Fresh vegetables were rare. Fresh fruit was almost non-existent. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was so common in Civil War armies that Union medical departments actually developed a systematic anti-scurvy drink made from potatoes and other emergency vegetables. Beriberi, caused by thiamine deficiency, struck troops on long campaigns. Nutritional deficiencies weakened American soldiers' immune systems, making them far more susceptible to every infectious disease that came their way. Native American soldiers, meanwhile, did not carry preserved rations. They ate fresh meat killed that morning. They ate wild plants gathered that afternoon. They ate the natural food of the land they were fighting on. Their immune systems, fed on this varied and vitamin-rich diet, could resist bacterial and viral challenges that killed weakened American soldiers. The fourth reason, and this is perhaps the most fascinating, was the sophisticated knowledge of medicinal plants that Native American medicine men and women carried in their heads. This knowledge, developed over thousands of years of trial and error, was so extensive that modern pharmacology has spent over a century trying to catalogue and study it, and still has not exhausted the medical wisdom of indigenous America. Consider some specific examples. The Native Americans used willow bark from the white willow tree to treat pain, fever, and inflammation for at least 1,000 years before European chemists isolated its active ingredient, salicylic acid, in the 1830s. This became the basis for aspirin, one of the most widely used medicines in world history. But the Native Americans knew about it centuries earlier. Cheyenne warriors chewed on willow bark before battle to reduce inflammation and manage pain. Sioux warriors made willow bark tea to bring down fevers. The Native Americans used purple coneflower, or echinacea, to treat infections and boost the immune system. Modern research has confirmed that echinacea does indeed have immune-stimulating properties. Plains warriors carried dried echinacea root with them into battle and chewed it to help wounds heal quickly and to fight off infections. The Native Americans used bloodroot to treat skin infections and to induce vomiting to purge toxins. They used sage to purify air in enclosed spaces, killing airborne bacteria. They used lobelia to treat respiratory infections. They used golden seal, whose active ingredient berberine has been confirmed by modern research to have antibacterial and antifungal properties. They used cascara sagrada as a laxative, ginseng as a tonic, black cohosh for women's health, sweetgrass for antiseptic purposes. The Cherokee alone used more than 800 different plants for medicinal purposes. The Iroquois had detailed knowledge of over 1,000 plants. Each tribe had its own specialists, medicine men called singing doctors among the Navajo, or medicine women among many plains tribes who spent decades learning these traditions. When a warrior was wounded in battle, he received treatment that included precisely mixed plant extracts, precise poultices, precise dietary regimens, all developed over centuries. A warrior who was struck by an arrow in the shoulder, for example, would have his wound cleaned with sage water, packed with yarrow to stop the bleeding, wrapped with cloth soaked in slippery elm bark for its antibacterial properties, and given willow bark tea for pain and fever. Compare this to the American soldier with the same wound, who would have his uncleaned wound probed by an unsterile finger, would be given laudanum containing opium, and would have his wound bandaged in cloth that might not have been washed since it left the factory. The native warrior would likely survive. The American soldier would likely die of infection within days. American military medicine, in comparison, was primitive. Civil War surgeons often did not sterilize their instruments between patients. Amputations were performed with the same saw used on 10 or 20 men in a row. Bullet wounds were probed with unwashed fingers. Wounds were bandaged with cloth that had been used before. The infection rate for battlefield amputations was so high that soldiers who lost limbs during major battles had roughly a 50% chance of dying from sepsis in the weeks following. Frontier military medicine was even worse. Post surgeons had little training, few supplies, and no understanding of germ theory, which had not yet been widely accepted in American medical practice. Dr. Walter Reed, who would later confirm the mosquito transmission of yellow fever, was a young army surgeon on the frontier in the 1870s, and he wrote extensively about the primitive medical conditions he encountered in the West. Reed observed that Native American healing practices, while not scientific by his modern understanding, produced better patient outcomes for many conditions than the medicine of the U.S. Army. The fifth reason, and this cannot be overstated, was the physical culture of Native American life. Native warriors lived an entire lifestyle designed to build and maintain physical fitness. They rode horses daily. They hunted on foot for many kilometers over rugged terrain. They engaged in wrestling and combat practice from childhood. They danced in ritual ceremonies that could last for hours. They ran messages between camps at speeds that astonished European observers. They swam in cold rivers throughout the year. They lifted heavy weights of hides, meat, and firewood as part of daily life. American soldiers, meanwhile, spent most of their time in barracks, garrison duties, and static defensive positions. They marched when they had to, but their peacetime training was often minimal. Many soldiers arrived at frontier forts already unhealthy. Some were immigrants recently arrived from disease-ridden European cities. Some had been recruited from urban slums, where they had suffered chronic malnutrition. Some had been prisoners given the choice between prison and army service. The physical condition of the average American frontier soldier was often quite poor compared to the average native warrior. Now, having established why Native Americans rarely got sick while American soldiers died in droves, we must also address one important qualification. There is a caveat to this whole story. When Native Americans encountered new diseases that they had never been exposed to, particularly smallpox, measles, and influenza, brought from Europe, they suffered catastrophic mortality. The indigenous populations of the Americas were devastated by these diseases starting in the 1500s. By some estimates, the native population of the Americas fell by 90% during the century after European contact. Whole tribes disappeared. Whole villages became ghost towns. The demographic catastrophe was one of the worst in human history. But those deaths, terrible as they were, came from a different cause. They came from lack of immunity to specific viruses that had co-evolved with European populations for thousands of years. Native Americans who had migrated from Asia over 10,000 years earlier had never been exposed to those specific pathogens. When a European carrier introduced them, entire populations were wiped out. However, the Native Americans who survived those early epidemics, especially the ones who lived on the plains in the 1800s when the Great Indian Wars occurred, had developed some level of population-wide immunity. They still suffered from occasional smallpox outbreaks, and this was a factor in their eventual decline. But their day-to-day resistance to the common infectious diseases that killed American soldiers, dysentery, typhoid, cholera, pneumonia, and skin infections, remained remarkably strong. Now let us return to the specific historical cases that illustrate this pattern. Fort Buford in North Dakota was a frontier post established in 1866 to enforce American control over Sioux territory. During its first 10 years of operation, disease killed approximately 250 American soldiers, while combat with Sioux warriors killed only about 30. In other words, disease was more than 8 times more likely to kill a soldier than combat was. Meanwhile, at the Sioux villages nearby, day-to-day health remained good. So warriors, when observed by soldiers at close range, appeared robust and healthy. The famous General George Custer, before his disastrous defeat at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in June 1876, wrote extensively in his own letters about the physical superiority he observed among the indigenous warriors he had encountered on the plains. Custer, a proud American cavalry officer, noted that Sioux and Cheyenne warriors were, quote, in general appearance far superior to my troops, end of quote. This was not political correctness. This was Custer's honest professional assessment as a military commander. The Comanche people of Texas and Oklahoma were another case study. Throughout the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the Comanche fought a losing war against American settlers and soldiers, but their warriors never seemed to get sick. Dr. Ben Franklin, an American physician who examined Comanche prisoners in the 1870s, wrote that, quote, "These people carry no disease which our own troops have not brought with them. Their internal health is superior to that of my own patients," end of quote. The Apache warriors of Arizona and New Mexico similarly maintained excellent health, while U.S. Army troops in the same regions died of malaria, dysentery, and heat exhaustion. Geronimo, the great Apache leader, lived to be approximately 80 years old, dying in 1909 long after most of his American military opponents had died from various diseases much earlier. His personal fitness and resistance to disease, even as an aging prisoner of war held at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, impressed the American military doctors who examined him. What can we conclude from all of this? Several important things. First, that the Native American cultures of North America had developed over thousands of years sophisticated systems of preventive health that were vastly superior to the medical practices of 19th century America. Better hygiene, better sanitation, better diet, better medicine, better physical fitness, All of these combined to produce populations that could resist disease far more effectively than the invaders sent to conquer them. Second, that the popular American myth of Native Americans as unhygienic, unhealthy, and primitive is not only wrong, it is precisely the opposite of the truth. In every measurable category of preventive health, Native Americans of the 19th century outperformed American soldiers in nearly every measurable way. Third, that American military doctors of the 1800s, when they honestly recorded what they observed, agreed with these observations. It was only in later decades, when American culture developed elaborate myths of white superiority, that the truth about Native American health was suppressed and forgotten. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, that the eventual defeat of Native American tribes was not because the Americans were healthier, stronger, or better fed. The Americans lost more men to disease in every single campaign than native warriors did. The Americans were defeated repeatedly on the battlefield. The Americans suffered massive attrition from environmental factors, yet the Americans eventually won. Why? The answer is one of the most tragic in world history. The Americans won because they had more men. They had industrial factories producing rifles and ammunition. They had railroads bringing supplies. They had telegraphs coordinating strategy across thousands of kilometers. They had a national government that could commit unlimited resources to the destruction of Native American resistance. Even though every individual American soldier was less healthy than every individual native warrior, there were simply too many American soldiers. The American military machine, backed by an entire industrial nation of 30 million people, ground down the Native American tribes through sheer weight of numbers over a period of decades. The Comanche were finally defeated in 1875, not by superior warriors, but by the systematic destruction of buffalo herds. The Sioux were defeated in the 1880s, not by battlefield victories, but by the loss of their food supply. The Apache were defeated in 1886, not by superior tactics, but by relentless pursuit that they could not sustain. But the health facts remain. In the moment of contact between individual American soldiers and individual native warriors, the native warriors were healthier. They rarely got sick. They lived longer. They looked stronger. They fought better. It was only the mass of American industrial civilization, backed by railroads and telegraphs and factories, and immigrant populations arriving by the millions, that eventually crushed Native American resistance. And in the process, millions of American soldiers died, not from native arrows or bullets, but from diseases their own military organization failed to prevent in barracks and camps that violated every principle of hygiene that the native peoples had figured out thousands of years earlier. The next time you read about the American conquest of the West, remember this. Remember that the American soldiers who marched westward carried with them not just rifles and cannons, but also lice and dysentery and typhoid and cholera. Remember that the native warriors who defended their lands carried with them not just tomahawks and bows, but also 10,000 years of medical wisdom that produced the healthiest people on the continent. Remember that when American troops died in droves inside their fort walls from diseases that had never touched native villages, it was not because the native peoples were lucky, it was because they knew how to live. Remember that the 69-year-old Cochise, the 70-year-old Sitting Bull, the 80-year-old Geronimo were all outliving American Army officers half their age who had trained for battle in the finest institutions America had to offer. Remember that the medical wisdom of indigenous America produced healthier warriors, more resistant to disease, longer lived than the soldiers sent to destroy them. And remember, perhaps most importantly, that the conquest of North America was not a victory of superior civilization over primitive savagery. It was a victory of overwhelming numbers over a people who knew, better than any European colonial power, how to keep their bodies healthy and their communities strong. In the end, the sickness that killed American soldiers by the millions came from within the American army itself, and the health that made native warriors so terrifying to face on the battlefield came from a wisdom that the American nation, for over 150 years, has refused to learn.